Today's topic, we want to clarify that the webinar today is focused on the person doing the abuse. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence and would like to speak to a confidential hotline, call the Philadelphia Domestic Violence Hotline at 866-723-3014. El tema de hoy, el tema de este webinar, se va a centrar en la persona que comete el abuso, no en la persona que está siendo abusada. Si usted o alguien que conoce está sufriendo violencia de pareja y desea hablar con una línea directa confidencial, llame a la línea de ayuda contra la violencia doméstica de Filadelfia. Es el 866-723-3014. Como ustedes saben, algunas de las como ustedes saben, esto se está filmando. As you know, this is recording, so just be aware of that. And I'm sorry I keep translating. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A symbol, and you can write your questions, and then at some point we would answer those. That said, let's start with our presenter. We are having today Tony Lapp. Tony Lapp has an LCSW and is the executive director of Courdea, a 40-year-old intervention program for people who have abused an intimate partner. Recipient of the 2014 Powerful Partner Award from Women's Way and the 2022 Advocacy Champion Award from Women Against Abuse, Tony is an experienced trainer, educator, writer, and therapist. A member of the National Network of Abuse Intervention Programs and past coordinator of the Domestic Abuse and Battery Intervention Network of Pennsylvania. Tony collaborates with projects in the Philadelphia area related to family violence, including shared safety, the IPV Home Visiting Service Coordination Project, the Domestic Violence Law Enforcement Committee of Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia Department of Human Services Domestic Violence Collaborative. Tony is a regular guest on radio and podcasts, including WHYY's Radio Times, the Fathering Circle podcast, and the When Dating Hurts podcast. He's co-author of numerous academic journal publications. Most recently, U.S. Maternal Mortality Solutions Must Include Addressing Intimate Partner Violence, in the August 2024 issue of American Journal of Public Health. Tony, we are so happy to have you here today. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to try now to make as efficient use as we can of this time. Liz, if you don't mind starting the slide thing so that we can at least look at that. Okay. So listen, I'm from an organization called Courdea. For those of you who have been in the community working in the community for a long time, you may know us by a previous name. For many years, our organization was called Menergy. The story of the name change is longer than I want to tell here, other than to simply say that we have long been a program where many men go to, but it has never been true that it's only men that come to our program, and that became confusing at a certain point. So, so that is one of the reasons for the name change. Here's some contact information. In the chat, you should see a link to another document that we're hoping that you can then have access to a PDF to refer to as you wish now, but also to have to refer to later. I think Liz just reshared it. That's great. And that has this contact information on it as well, so we can move forward here. Thanks. So we're gonna, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're going to focus on today, but just to also say that because of time constraints, there are some limitations in terms of what we can get to today. So I did want to also say that if you're interested in further in getting a little further into some questions related to work with abusive partners, there is a local organization called BH10, the Behavioral Health and Training Education Network. The website is BH10, BHTEN, that's N as in Nancy.com, that offers trainings for behavioral health folks and also community folks. So there are a number of trainings available there that are related to work with abusive partners. I'm involved with some of it. So that's a place where you could dive into this further if you're interested. But for today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to focus on these things, and then I hope to leave some time interspersed, but also at the end for questions. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail. You're going to get the very brief version about like what programs like the program that I work for are about. There were some and questions before the training related to research and evidence. So I would like to talk about that briefly. I want to do a little bit of talking about sort of screening or asking questions about abusive behavior, harmful behavior, and some suggestions for how to respond. I have a very simple thing that I want to bring, not meant to be comprehensive, but I hope it will be helpful related to bystander situations, and then to talk a little bit about referral. So that's going to be the structure of what we do with the rest of this hour, aside from questions. You can move forward here, Liz. Thanks. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about research because there were some questions from people who signed up for the training. First of all, I just want to sort of try to situate programs like ours in terms of like where they fit in regards to what we understand to be most effective. So if we're thinking about public health and what we understand in terms of like investment and impact, if you use the model almost of like diseases, which is what public health sort of builds on. So you have levels of how you work with something. So like if we use, I'm going to use the example of a sickness to make my illustration here. So if we would use something like cholera. So cholera is a disease that gets passed through the water supply. You know, the simple, most effective, least cost thing to do for cholera is to clean up the water supply. The second most effective thing to do is to target people who are vulnerable populations. In that case, it means the young, the elderly, and folks that have other kinds of health challenges. And then the third level, and the one that's the most costly, and honestly, the least effective is to treat people who are already sick. So I just want to make this point that when we talk about evidence-based stuff and about research around programs, when it comes to social ills, we tend to be more willing as a society to fund things that fall into that third level intervention. We do this medically, we do this behaviorally. So we know some things about violence prevention. Like, for example, one of the things that we know, there's been a lot of research around this. I direct you to a man named James Gilligan, who's done a bunch of research around prevalence of violence. And one of the things that seems very evident, actually, is that in industrialized societies, as levels of inequity grow or shrink, that has a huge impact on prevalence of violence, whether that be intimate violence or street violence or whatever. We know that there would be ways for us to be addressing issues of violence that would be much more related to sort of how we structure our country. A second level would be like working with young people and older people. And the reality is there's not a lot of work being done. And there should be. I'm actually here to pitch that we ought to be doing much more work with folks that are sort of vulnerable populations, and we don't, and there isn't funding related to it. So I'm coming to you as a representative of the third level, which is what you would expect to be the most costly and the least effective. But it is the place where we tend to put resources and to structure our programs. So I say that by way of saying, not by way of saying it as an excuse, but by way of saying it as an explanation, that when we talk about evidence related to work with adults, we're talking about folks that are already, if you think about it this way, symptomatic. So it is true that work with adults is very hard, and that when you're thinking about impact, the expectation is that the impact would also be less. Just a small parenthesis to say that this is also, like, if we're really interested in changing our future related to family violence, one of the things that we can be thinking about as a very effective way that we can be doing this work is in the modeling and the care and the training that we're giving to our young people, to our kids. What we're teaching them about sort of like home life and gender roles and relationships and expectations and things like that. What they see and what they learn from us can, if it becomes part of their expectation, can very much have a big impact in the future. So that is a pitch that I'd like to be making for you to be as you're thinking about how you want to be in the world and who you want to be thinking about trying to have an impact on. So now the question of evidence-based. I think that I will say our program is 40 years old. It makes it one of the older ones in the country. But having said that, 40 years is actually quite short. And although there are legitimate claims to evidence base related to particular tools that are part of the work, and some things related to particular sort of structures or programming, it's not. I don't think that it's supportable to claim that at this point we can say that work with abusive partners is firmly in the evidence-based camp. There is a lot of interest in the practitioner world around research and being able to sort of be working with our models to make them increasingly impactful. But a lot of the stuff that we consider evidence-based has been based on particular populations, isn't necessarily applicable to other populations at this point. A last thing, another thing now I want to say about measuring impact. There is some differing, there's been some back and forth in terms of like how you measure impact of programs at best. And I think I hope this will make sense while also we could all wish that this would be stronger. When adjusting for a few things, like, for example, how long people stay in a program and what kind of accountability and support systems there are for people as they come into the program, but around the program. In other words, how are they being held both supportively and accountably by the systems around programs? When you adjust for those things, what appears to emerge is moderate impact. Moderate impact does not sound impressive. But I will tell you that for adult populations, moderate impact is the gold standard, and that most programming being done with adults falls at best into that camp if it's doing measurably impactful work. And now a last thing I want to say about this, and this is all I'll try to touch on related to research and evidence, is that there's been some interesting research around how programs get used in the real world. And this has a big impact or a big implication for when you're working with, especially in the area of moderate impact. If you know that, for example, some people will be dramatically impacted, sort of life-changingly impacted, probably a larger percentage will be measurably impacted in the way that you would want them to go, but maybe not at the level that you would wish for, and that some people you just don't reach, then knowing some stuff about how programs get used in the real world can actually be important, because if you do it intentionally, you can do it more impactfully. So one of the things that researchers have been suggesting is that programs that work with abusive partners, the ways that they get used in the real world is, A, of course, to try to get people to change. That is a big piece of what we're always trying to do. But B, another way that programs get used is for the partners of people that have been acting abusively or harmfully to gather information for their decision-making process. And so sometimes that information is the information that partners would want, that it is information, positive information. They're seeing their partner change. things are getting better in the relationship. Sometimes it's not the information they would want. Sometimes it's about sort of recognizing that the person doesn't appear to be changing. But that can still be useful information as partners are making decisions. It may not be the information they would have wished for, but it still may be able to help them to be able to make decisions that they need to do. And then another thing is for accountability systems, however those accountability systems are set up, to um, to uh, um, to make decisions, because accountability systems, whether they be formal things like courts or informal things like community groups or faith communities, because we definitely get referrals from different kinds of systems to be making decisions about how to relate to this person that they're trying to get some help. Um, okay. Do you mind switching to the next one? Thanks. Okay. Um, So programs like ours have been set up, sometimes working with courts. A lot of programs are set up to work with people referred by courts. But then there's increasingly also referrals from many other kinds of systems. So we get, as I mentioned, from community groups and faith communities, from therapists, from HR departments, because the partner of the person is asking them to go, because the person themselves has found the information. We get people a lot of different ways, but and then when they get here, part of our job then is to sort of figure out with them whether what is important to them, and if there's anything from the things that they consider important in their lives, their priorities, that are connected to this. Um, but part of the reason why I wanted to mention this business of screening is this issue of like actually asking the question. So I want to tell you a story about something that we were involved with a number of years ago. It was a project related to fathers, to specifically male parents. Um, and we were interested in sort of what that worked in programs that were working with fathers, what their perspective was and what their practice was, and if there was a connection. And a fascinating thing emerged from some research work that we were connected to, which was that there were some programs that thought that that domestic abuse was a big issue in the lives of the people that they worked with, the fathers that they were working with, and there were some people that thought, no, we're not really hearing much about it. And there was a real big divide. Uh, and there was a fascinating correlation between um, who thought that it was a big issue and who was actually asking the questions. In other words, in programs where questions were asked, they were getting answers that were shaping their perspective on what was happening. Whereas in programs where the question wasn't being asked, there was very little awareness that it was a big thing because the question was not asked. So so here's a thing that I want to talk about. There has been a number of years now where in many settings it is part of practice to ask questions about whether somebody's getting hurt in a relationship. And that's really important. Like we should be absolutely doing it. Um, and there are some pockets of places where people are starting to ask questions and to try to learn how to do this comfortably about whether somebody is hurting someone. Uh, there's and that is that the interesting thing about that is that there are now increasing numbers of people and places where that really is becoming something that's a normal part of practice, and where people feel pretty confident and comfortable asking the question. So I wanted to um, talk a little bit about uh, just simply asking the question. So if you wouldn't mind clicking one more time, Liz. There we go. Just reasons for asking the question. And when I'm saying asking the question, I'm saying the question of whether somebody's hurting somebody, not just whether somebody's getting hurt, but whether they're hurting someone. Um, Just the idea. So in many of the families that we're connected to, um, the harm that's happening, the abuse that's happening, is held very much as a secret within the family, and that secret gets protected by many members of the family, to the extent that many people really do have the impression that this is something that we actually just couldn't even talk about. Um, so one of the reasons for asking the question, aside from whether a person discloses or not in the moment, is that it's really important to start normalizing that we actually can talk about this. That at the end of the day, it's something that could be talked about. My primary care doctor does this with every patient that he has, and he frames it so beautifully. He says, listen, we know we know that people in relationships, now I'm going to ask you some questions about your relationships, is what he says. He says, the reason I'm going to do this is because we know that people in relationships argue. We know people have conflict, but we also know that a certain level of conflict in relationships is actually connected to, associated with physical health and emotional well-being. So we actually think of this as part of our care for you to ask questions. And then he asks the questions in a very relaxed way, in a way that you feel very cared for and very loved by this man, as he's asking not just whether in your family life, whether you're getting hurt, but whether maybe you're hurting someone. Um, so you're also part of the thing too is to be asking the questions, and so you're opening a door for the future. So sometimes you ask a question, somebody may say no, that's fine. But it may be that as you have contact with them another time, if you ask the question again, that their life circumstances have shifted, and that whatever it was that was keeping them from feeling like they could answer before now has shifted. And so you ask as a way of sort of opening a door that maybe later the person might want to consider going through. Could you click on the next thing, Liz? Um, I have a friend, and this is also another doctor friend, who went to a training once where they were um, uh, talking about the idea of asking questions about whether someone was hurting people in their family. And he said this thing that I thought was so smart. He said, I want to talk about where my hesitancy is. He said, I've asked my patients uh, questions for many years about whether they're getting hurt. I think of this as part of my work. I think it's a part of what makes me effective to do this. I'm really committed to it. I'm interested in doing this other thing, but here's where I get hung up. I think part of what makes me a good doctor is that I really care about my patients. And I'm worried that if somebody would say something to me, describe something that they had done that I find really repulsive, like that I find just shocking and horrible, um, that I worry that I would find myself caring less for that person. And so I'm worried that that would make me not as good of a doctor. I actually thought this was a really self-aware question, um, uh, articulated so beautifully. I thought he was pulling out something that was really important for many of us to be thinking about if we consider ever having conversations around whether somebody has hurt someone. I was also glad that I wasn't the trainer at the time. I was much younger in this work, and I don't think that I would have had as good of an answer as the person who was the trainer. So she said, this was a woman who worked in a VA, a veterans hospital, and had many years of experience, really quite remarkable person. She said, what I try to do is I try to find the part of the person that would like to be different. And that's the part that I relate to. That's the part I build connection with. And I thought that that was really wise, and also fairly accurate about who we are as human beings, right? That we're oftentimes um, we are a mix of different impulses and different thought processes. All of us have capacity towards pettiness and cruelty, also capacity towards kindness and connection, and that it is true that relating to that piece is a way of inviting that piece of who that person is to develop more. So, so I wanted to give you the following. This is going to be just like a four-step thing that's related to um, how to be thinking of like if a person actually would disclose. Like, what do I do? Because if I can set myself up to try to be thinking about how I'm wanting to relate to the part of the potential in that person for change, but also like the what they need in the moment. Um, so one of the things that I'd like to ask you to consider is when a person discloses stuff that's been held a deeply guarded secret, one of the things that they're doing is they're choosing to do something rather vulnerable. They're taking a risk. So the first step of what I wanted to suggest, and Liz, if you could click on that, is to offer support and respect for the vulnerability, for the risk. And so what that could look like is language something like this. I'm really glad you told me about this. Not everybody would be willing to talk about it. It says a lot about who you are as a person. I think I might have a typo here. Interesting. Um, that you are willing. Okay, there it is. Yeah. So basically, the idea that not to forget that not to forget that um, that this is something that's worth paying attention to, worth attending to, is that initial support or respect. Uh, but if you do that, if you don't forget that thing, then that opens up other doors, like for the next thing there to just now express concern. But think about how differently this lands if you've done the other thing first, right? Now that I know, I also want you to hear that I'm worried. I'm worried about what this means for you and for your partners and for your kids, right? That's a really important thing to be able to say, um, but it also lands differently if you've done the other thing first. Okay, next thing. What do I mean by measured hope? When I say measured hope, here's what I'm trying to say. There actually is much evidence. There's been lots of research around this that about the human potential for change. There are many examples of all kinds of people changing in all kinds of different life circumstances, at different stages of life, in different situations. Um, Change is something that actually does happen quite regularly. That, having said that, it also is true that change is hard, and that many of us don't change. If I would invite you to think about your own life and what times where you have changed and things that you think that you should change, but that you haven't managed to do, just to sort of recognize that for all of us, change is not necessarily something that we do frequently and with ease. Um, so basically, measured hope is you could do something about this, other people have, but it's often hard to do it on one's own. It's basically you're setting up expectations that this may be something that requires effort and that could benefit from some support. And then the last thing is to make connection, right? And that's part of why I'm here today. There, it is true that there are programs like ours in different places around the country. They're not in every community by any means, but that one of the things that I'm interested in is you having a connection to a place that does actually work with people who are trying to change their abusive behavior. So to be able to say this, there's people that work with people. Would you be interested in connecting? And I could help. So this is a suggestion for how to be responding. And then at the end, when I come back, I want to talk about um, like how to make that referral. Um, Before we do, and so what I'm going to do, we have two more slides. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about bystander stuff, and then I want to talk about referrals, and then I want to see if there's any questions, and that's what we're going to do with the time that we have remaining. So first of all, let's go to the next slide here and switch gear. Oh no, I forgot about this. Oh, I do want to show you this. So I mentioned this doctor, part of a practice now that's rolling this out practice wide. And just to show you how simple something like this can be, this is something that they are now instituting across the practice where they have a card that they give to people, but then they check in with them afterwards. So just recognizing that in many stages of our lives, or different interactions, we may not have, may have other pressures for time pressures and things like that. But that if we do it this way, if it can be as simple as this last question of, have you done or think you might do any of the things described above to your partner or someone close to you? And if you answer yes, then we'd like to support you and we're happy to talk to you more and connect you to someone around confidentiality. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to give you that as an example of how something can be set up relatively simply and in a straightforward way. Okay, now let's move to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about bystander stuff. First of all, this isn't there are trainings about bystander situations that are much more thorough than this. I am wanting for us to be talking today just about something really simple. And this last thing is this suggestion. But first of all, just to make the point that in bystander situations, it's really hard to get it completely right. It really is, because things are sometimes moving very quickly. They're very stimulating. I'm talking about situations where, for example, I just had my neighbors come back to me and say, hey, we had a situation. We really wondered, we were trying to figure out what to do. Do you have thoughts about this? And they described a really upsetting situation where a person was really yelling at their partner, nasty, really loud, right in their face. And the other person was really shut down, and they were trying to figure out it was in a public setting, and they were trying to figure out what to do. So I want to say that here are things that I notice happen in my body in those kinds of situations. I notice myself get tight. I notice myself being anxious inside, feeling responsible, but also feeling stiff because I'm anxious because I know that it's hard to get it right, that I have a tendency to tighten up. And that there are some times that I've tried to do something that I don't think was the right thing to do, and it has tended to be along the lines of responding in a very forceful and angry way. And I think that was not the right thing to do in terms of like how the person reacted, but also in terms of like what I think might have happened. Because I do this business about, so before I move on from that first point, I want to say this, that I think it's good to be gentle with ourselves around the pressures that we feel in these moments, and to not be judging ourselves too harshly, and to be aware that there are some times where it is not possible to do something meaningful in that moment. Uh, uh, Now, going into the second point, because the first priority is, of course, to not make things worse. And one of the really tricky things about uh, domestic abuse situations is that so much of it happens behind walls, right? And closed doors. And public shaming can result in private punishment. So So being careful about how we act in those moments is probably pretty useful. I wanted to just share with you two comments from two people that have been useful to me. One that we had hanging in our office for many years. It's a Maya Angelou quote, and it says, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And so that's one of the things to be thinking about. And then there's another man who I would actually really recommend as some if you're interested in thinking about relational stuff. Has a lot of wisdom to share. A man named Terrence Real. That's Terry or Terrence Real. Has written several books, and he's a couples therapist, but he's got some really great relational stuff. And one of the things that Terry says is that harshness does nothing that loving firmness doesn't do better. Um, so, yeah, so with that said, I want to suggest that if we can't get ourselves to a place where we can remember that, that probably we shouldn't be trying to do something. And that's hard, right? But if the priority is to not make things worse, then that's a useful thing to be able to keep in mind. Um, However, if I can get myself to a place where I think that I could interact in a way that could be connecting and loving, then I have a kind of a counterintuitive approach. Um, I think that the thing that comes up for me, and why do I say counterintuitive? I think because I think the thing that has come up for me and that I've heard described from lots of other folks is that rightfully so, in bystander situations, the first place that we often go in terms of our empathy and our kindness is with the person who is the target of the bad behavior. And so that is the person that we would like to connect with and support. Um, However, it's very complicated in those situations to be able to do that safely. So, a way to try to de-escalate things is to focus on and try to express concern for the person who's acting badly. Um, and and then to talk about our own how it's impacting us. So what do I mean by this? I mean something's very simple like, "Hey, are you okay?" To the person who's acting really badly. "Are you okay? I'm really worried about you." Like, because like right now you're I'm kind of scared actually. Uh, are you okay? Is there anything I can do? That kind of thing. As a potential for de-escalation may not work. It may not be something that I feel capable of doing. But as a strategy for trying to help somebody to catch themselves in the moment, um, uh, because here's the thing, we know this about moments of upset is that when our bodies get taken over by adrenaline, when we're in a crisis mode, that um, it's an awful lot like you know those Amish buggies out in the center part of the state, and how they have horses that go out on the road with cars, and how to keep the cars from getting spooked, the horses from getting spooked, they put blinders on the side of them so that upset moment is a moment where our vision becomes a lot like that, really tunnel vision, very focused right immediately on the moment. And it is very easy in those moments to lose complete track of what's happening around me. And so to be vivid and caring and talking about your own reaction is one potential way to kind of like shock a person out of that moment. Doesn't always work, but but it has some potential. Okay. Now the last thing, and then I want to switch to questions here, is to, if you could click, Liz, that'd be great. Thanks. Yeah, just how to refer. So so our program, if you're interested in learning more about it, like I said, the BH10 trainings are a place where you could potentially get that. We have our website, courdea.org, with some information. But here's a few things that I would want you to know. We have a point person. If you could click, Liz, for intake. Her name is Melinda Wilson. Here's her email address. This is also in the sheet that we gave you a link to. Here's her phone number. Because we are small, she is sometimes on the phone with other people. So if you don't get her immediately, please do leave a message and she'll reach back to you. She is able to handle most general things and is the person that people go through to get connected to the program. And she's skilled at talking people into the program. So that's one person for you to know. Next one, if you could, Liz, thanks. If you have questions about handling of a case, and just to be aware of this, this could be as a behavioral health or mental health or health professional, but it could also be as a friend or as a member of a community that you're wishing to figure out how to be supportive. Our director of clinical programs, Noelle Hobson, is wonderful. Same number, different extension. Oh, I gave wrong. That should say Noelle Hobson at Courdea.org. Sorry about that. It's a typo, but she's available for talking through scenarios. And trying to figure out if it's an appropriate time to try to make a connection to a program like ours or not. Next thing, if you could, Liz, thanks. Okay. Just to say this, that if you're wishing to refer somebody, there will be a step at some point that we will want the person themselves to reach out to us to initiate direct contact. Mostly that's because we're wanting to make sure that we're not by the simple act of reaching out, provoking something that is creating a safety issue for other people in that person's life. So we want some show that they themselves have expressed interest or at least willingness to get connected to our program. There are some systems that have people sign releases saying that they want to be contacted and then send their information. And in those situations, absolutely we'll reach out. But otherwise, for setting your expectations correctly, this is what we want. And then the last thing I want to say is this, if you could click there, Liz, is that programs like ours, working with abusive partners, working with people who cause harm, are very different than programs that work with advocacy or do advocacy work with people that are getting hurt. And here is a really big way in which it's different. It is hard to get somebody to be willing to make connection to a program, and so in practical terms, what that means is that that's fewer numbers. And so what the good part of that is that there's not usually a delay. So one of the nice things that you should know is that typically if a person makes contact with us and they follow through, we can usually get them set up in a week. So it's a pretty quick process where we get them meeting with someone individually first to try to figure out what's been going on. And then typically moving into group work where people are working on changing their behavior and doing it in very sort of practical terms. So without going into further detail about the program, I do want to make sure that I offer a little bit of time here for questions. Liz, we didn't really talk through how to see that. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Yeah, and Liz will
Uh,
take care of that. But before we even get there, thank you so much,
Great.
Tony, on behalf of the Office of Domestic Violence Strategies for all that information. And yeah, we still have time for questions, so that's great.
Yes, thank you so much, Tony. We had a number of questions that people asked at registration. And I think some of them are related to the topic that you talked about with bystander intervention, though this may be more about maybe not witnessing something directly, but becoming aware that someone you know, either a friend or family member, has acted abusively. Several people asked about what should you do if you find out a friend has been has a history of abusive behavior in romantic relationships. So something along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the thing that I would want to say is that to some extent it depends. It depends who you have contact with and what your sense is um, of um, of their willingness to talk about it and safety. But that said, I do think that we can get pretty hung up on whether or not something can be talked about, and this framework of starting with appreciation, starting with support, care, respect, that is a place to begin. And if you do that first, it opens up doors for talking about your concerns, right? So that first of all, starting with, I'm really, really glad that you're telling me. Um, and I'm interested in talking to you about like what it could mean to work on that. I'm happy to try to get to support you and work with you around that. Something along those lines is a really connective thing. Um, yeah. Maybe just as a sort of a sidebar to that, a place where it gets a little trickier is if somebody tells you that their partner's hurting you, right? Because then where the disclosure hasn't happened from the person who's doing the hurt. So then the question, then I would really strongly suggest that your thinking be guided by the person who's getting hurt. That their sense of their own safety and the other person's openness and willingness is something that is a better guide for your decision than your own thoughts. And that and that to the extent that um, uh, to the extent that they're, that they have sort of safety concerns, that you should take them seriously. Um, uh, that a way of another thing just related to that, and I think it's connected to Quinn's question here, in the question and answers. Quinn, if someone doesn't seem like they're in a place of wanting to work on themselves and change their behavior okay, so that's a slightly different thing. The thing I wanted to say is that uh, getting an abused partner to a place where they are in a safer and stronger place in their lives, have greater clarity, have greater support, is oftentimes doing something to help the person who acts abusively. I will tell you from experience that that it is one of the pathways of people coming to our program, that their partner who they had harmed went and got help, got stronger, got to a place where they were willing and able now to put more limits on the person's behavior, and in the face of the potential for loss because the partner had gotten to a better place, then people were more willing and more interested in more open to the idea of getting change. So it's not, sometimes it's a roundabout way, but you can still be having that as a goal that you're working towards. Okay. Uh, I'm trying to think. Maria, I would be happy to talk to you about that stuff, but maybe we should do that offline, if that's okay. Quinn, the thing about if they're sort of disclosing but not really showing motivation, that is a really interesting question, right? So that I will tell you that the thing that this is something that we deal with in the program and all the time, and that tools around that generally have to do with if you have tools around motivational interviewing, this is the place to start engaging those. So having a sense of what is actually important in the person's life, what matters to them, and if there is a way in which there is a connection between what they're doing and what they want in their lives, sometimes that can help really to help a person to move along. If they still have not, I mean.
So I think another question from an anonymous person says, should we keep trying to help an abusive friend if they still have not admitted to the abuse that their partner has alleged? Which is I think that's a good question, and one related to what you've talked about already, but
Yeah.
another aspect of the safety considerations.
Right. Yeah. I do think that it depends on where what's needed in that system. So for example, I think that if a person's not ready to take responsibility and to make changes, then it could be that for a period of time, the attention, the support, it is focused on the person who's getting hurt, to try to get them as much support as possible. And so that's one way to do it. Another thing to do, and this works better in the context of community, is that there is the possibility, community or systems, accountability systems, that there is the possibility of consequence, right? So, in some situations, people get, I'll use the example of a faith community, get removed from a position of leadership or a position of access to some such thing, with the invitation that if they're willing to go and get some help, then that can be reconsidered. But just the idea of that we do actually know that consequences sometimes have an impact, but that there's some predictability about where they will be impactful, that they tend to be much more impactful with people who have something to lose. And so figuring out what it is that the person actually cares about losing is really useful. And that as much as possible, if I can do it in a way that generates as little resentment as possible, right? So in the context of, we do care about you, but this is something that's not okay and really needs to stop. And so we're really wanting for you to take this seriously, and to reach for help. But we also want you to hear that if you're not willing to do that these are steps that we're going to feel like we have to take. That is actually an okay thing to do. That can be done in a loving way. And if we can do it in a way that creates that accountability, but in a caring setting, sometimes, maybe not every time, but sometimes we potentially have the ability to impact something before it gets to the point where systems like courts and police and stuff get involved, where things really do start to feel quite punitive and oftentimes happen in pretty inequitable ways.
This is a great question. How do you navigate when a couple is being abusive to or hurting each other?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that there are different scenarios for that kind of situation. There's sometimes, I want to say this. I think that all relationships involve hurt, and that people do hurt each other in relationships. So I think that the idea that that doesn't exist is sort of not realistic, that people do hurt each other, but what we're talking about is levels. And so in some situations where there's mutual harm happening, there's a big inequity in terms of like who's doing it and with what motivation. And if that is something that can be clarified, sometimes that can really help. If it is a situation where it really does seem like there's a lot of harm happening, and it does seem to be in a situation where the relative power thing is not that different, then I think that, well, if it's physical harm, I think that the recommendation would be for each of them to be separately doing some work on themselves before thinking about any kind of conjoint thing. But yes, that is possible, and it does happen. We've seen couples like that. MB, there's a program out of Joseph J. Peters. Yeah, so and there are a couple programs in the surrounding counties too. Great, thank you, Asu. That's wonderful.
Please
thank you all.
There. So it's 12:59. Let me see if there's one. I think Tony, you addressed the questions. So I want to thank you again for coming with us. As people know, we are the Office of Domestic Violence Strategies. We do community education. We usually focus on the survivor and how to support the survivor and resources available. And it's great to have you and talk the other, how we call it, the other side of domestic violence, and what we could do also to intervene with the person that it is doing the abuse. And as you said, we still can do it from a caring way, from a caring space, and try to help to intervene earlier so it doesn't have to be only the criminal justice system responding. So thank you, everyone. There are resources in the chat and also there. And thank you, Liz. There is a link there so you can give us feedback from this webinar.
Thank you, everybody.